Hello everyone, and welcome back to Cafe Tales. I'm ANS, and I'm really glad you're here with me today. Pull up a chair, pour yourself something warm. This is your moment to slow down. Before we begin, I want to ask, what are you sipping on right now? Tea, coffee, something else? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if you're new here, welcome. Please do subscribe. It helps this little channel more than you know. Now, let's settle in together and begin. Chapter 1. A November Morning in Brecklingfun. The village of Brecklingfun was, by any fair account, at its most beautiful in November, which was not the usual opinion of visitors, who generally arrived in June and left before they had time to understand the place properly. In June the village was green and cheerful and made no particular demands on the attention. But in November, when the elms had given everything up and stood bare and legible against a pewter sky, and when the chalk lane running from the church to the high street gleamed faintly with frost each morning until 10:30, and when the smell of wood smoke had settled into every curtain and coat in the village like a shared secret. In November, Brecklingfun revealed a character that was older, quieter, and considerably more interesting than its summer self. The High Street, which was called the High Street by courtesy rather than by any claim to elevation, contained the usual appointments of a village of perhaps 400 souls, a post office that was also a newsagent, and, on Tuesday afternoons, an informal registry of local grievances, a chemist whose proprietor, Mr. Hadley, was known to dispense advice with considerably greater confidence than he dispensed medication, a lending library that occupied the front room of Mrs. Pilcher's house and operated on a system of absolute personal trust that had, in 30 years, resulted in the permanent disappearance of only 2 volumes, one of which had been borrowed by Mrs. Pilcher herself, and a grocer's shop belonging to the Spence family, which was long and dark and smelled of coffee and paraffin and the particular variety of cheddar that Mr. Spence ordered from a farm in Somerset and kept under a glass dome on the counter with a devotion that bordered on the ceremonial. On the morning of the 12th of November, which was a Wednesday and therefore already possessed of a certain middling gravity, Mrs. Partridge came out of the post office at 9:07 and encountered Mrs. Fawkes on the pavement. Mrs. Partridge was a tall woman with a permanent expression of considered alarm, and Mrs. Fawkes was a small woman with the bright, anticipatory eyes of someone who has spent a lifetime waiting for exactly this kind of news. What Mrs. Partridge said to Mrs. Fawkes occupied approximately 90 seconds, during which time Mrs. Fawkes's expression passed through several distinct stages: surprise, a rapid recalibration of surprise into something graver, and then, barely perceptible but entirely genuine, a small and quickly suppressed flicker of excitement at being, for once, the person who had just been told rather than the person who already knew. Word travels in a village with remarkable efficiency. By the time Miss Marple reached Spence's grocer's at 9:20, she had stopped briefly to examine the state of Mrs. Hartley's front gate, which had been hanging at a dangerous angle since October, and which someone really ought to report. The shop already carried that particular atmosphere of suppressed agitation which she recognized at once as the ambient condition of a place that has absorbed an unexpected piece of news and has not yet decided how to present it. Mr. Spence himself was behind the counter, cutting string from around a paper parcel with more care than the task required. His daughter Claire, who was 17 and usually to be found doing her homework on the low shelf behind the tinned goods, was standing upright and very still near the window in the manner of someone listening to something that was not presently being said. Miss Marple asked for a 1/4 pound of the best butter, 2 eating apples, whatever was freshest, she didn't mind, and a small jar of the pressed tongue, if there was any left. Mr. Spence, cutting the string, said that Mr. Featherby had not opened this morning. Miss Marple, who was examining the apples in the bowl on the counter with the careful attention she brought to most things that were near her hands, said that was unusual, wasn't it? Mr. Featherby was generally so reliable. Mr. Spence said that was rather the concern. Reliable was the word. The blind hadn't gone up. The delivery box was still on the step. And Mrs. Coburn, who cleaned for him on Wednesdays, had found the door unlocked when she arrived at 8:30, but no one inside. and the kitchen showing signs. He paused here, with the air of a man selecting from a range of available phrases of some disturbance. Miss Marple asked, very mildly, what sort of disturbance? Mr. Spence said he understood a chair had been overturned, and something broken. He wasn't sure what. He had heard this from Mrs. Coburn, who had told Mrs. Partridge, and things did sometimes acquire additional detail in the passage. Miss Marple selected the smaller of the two apples, turned it over once, and placed it with the other in her basket. She said that cooking apples were really so much more versatile, she found, and that she would take the tongue if he had it, and that she hoped Mr. Featherby would turn up quite soon, as he had been holding a pair of her late husband's cufflinks for repair, and she did not like to think of them going astray. She paid, and she left, and the little bell above the door made its small statement behind her. Outside, the chalk lane gleamed in the thin morning sun, and Miss Marple walked home at her own pace, which was unhurried without being slow. Chapter 2. The Shape of the Ordinary. Owen Featherby was, or had been, for the village was already quietly constructing both tinses, the proprietor of the watch and clock repair shop that stood between the chemist and the lending library on the high street, in a narrow building that leaned very slightly to the left, as if it had been listening to Mrs. Pilcher's library for so many years that it had formed the habit. He was a man of 61, a widower these past 9 years, careful in his dress and in his opinions, with large, steady hands that were particular about their work and a manner that was courteous without being warm, which in a village of Breckling Fund's size and disposition was more than sufficient. He had, as Mr. Spence had said, not opened this morning. This was the fact from which all other considerations proceeded. Constable Dyer arrived at Featherby's shop at 20 minutes to 10. He was a large young man with a serious face and the particular expression of someone who has been trained to maintain calm and has not yet found this as easy as the training suggested. He found the door unlocked, as Mrs. Coburn had said. He found the kitchen, which opened directly off the workshop, with the chair overturned, a ceramic mug broken at the base of the cooker, and a scatter of small things. A pencil, a handful of clock screws, a worn leather notebook, across the floor, as if the surface of the workbench had been disturbed hurriedly or with some force. He did not find Mr. Featherby. What he found instead, which was the detail that would exercise Breckling Fund for the rest of the month and beyond, was a quantity of blood, not dramatic, not large, but specific and deliberate in the way that such things are specific when they are present in rooms where they ought not to be. On the flagstone floor near the back door, which led into the service alley behind the high street shops. The back door was bolted from the inside. This was the fact that Constable Dyer wrote in his notebook at 9:47 in the morning and then looked at for a long time, his pencil motionless above the page, because it was one of those facts which, on first encounter, seemed to make everything simpler, and on second consideration, made everything considerably more complicated. By noon, Sergeant Makepeace had arrived from Holt. By noon, the high street carried the dense, prickling quality of a place where people are actively not standing in groups discussing something, which is a very different thing from a place where nothing is being discussed at all. Miss Marple, at home on Croft Lane, was making soup from the heel of a ham and some late-season leeks, and listening to the way the wind had begun to move in the elm at the bottom of the garden. It was the kind of wind that meant a change of weather before evening, she thought. She would need to bring in the remaining dahlias. She had not yet spoken to anyone since returning from Spence's. She had, however, been thinking, in the low, unhurried, almost peripheral way in which she thought most productively, about one or two things that had been said this morning, and one or two things that had not. The thing that interested her most was not the overturned chair, and not the blood, though she had been told about the blood by Mrs. Fowkes, who had telephoned at 11 to share what she had learned from Mrs. Coburn, who had reconsidered the details of her discovery in the light of subsequent events and found them more significant than she had originally represented. The thing that interested Miss Marple most was the matter of the bolted door. Not that it was bolted, though that was interesting too, but that everyone, in all the conversations she had heard today, seemed to have drawn from the bolted door precisely one conclusion, and to have drawn it very quickly, and to have found it entirely satisfactory. Miss Marple, in her considerable experience of human nature, had found that conclusions which arrived very quickly and proved entirely satisfactory were occasionally correct. They were somewhat more often not. She tasted the soup, added a pinch of salt, and turned the heat down. Chapter 3. The Market and the Chemist. Thursday's weekly market came to Breckling Fun in the form of 7 stalls arranged on the green beside the church. 2 for vegetables, 1 for honey and preserves, 1 for second-hand goods of varying provenance, 1 for the haberdashery and household linens that Miss Tanner brought in from Fakenham each week in a van of improbable size, 1 for fish from a man named Crisp, whose prices were fair and whose conversation was not, and 1, not strictly a stall, but rather a large folding table, belonging to Mrs. Elcott, for the sale of her surplus garden produce, which at this time of year meant leeks, winter squash, some very good late celeriac, and the small hard apples from the tree at the end of her kitchen garden, which she described as cookers and which were, in Miss Marple's view, somewhat more suited to being admired than consumed. Miss Marple arrived at the market at 10:30, having collected her basket and her better winter coat, which she put on not because the morning was especially cold, but because it had begun to drizzle and the better coat had a deeper pocket. The market, on the morning after Mr. Featherby's disappearance, had acquired a quality she recognized easily. People were spending longer than usual at each stall. Nobody was buying more. They were simply remaining and talking. At Mrs. Elcott's table, Miss Marple selected a celeriac of considerable size, which she turned twice in her hands before accepting, and in the course of this transaction learned from Mrs. Elcott that Sergeant Makepeace had interviewed Mrs. Coburn, and that Mrs. Coburn's account had now fixed upon the detail, not mentioned on Wednesday, that the broken mug on the kitchen floor had been warm to the touch when she arrived. Miss Marple said that was interesting. She asked, by no means as a connected thought, whether Mrs. Elcott's celeriac had done well this autumn, as her own had been rather stringy, which she attributed to the dry spell in August. Mrs. Elcott, pleased to discuss the celeriac, talked at some length. In the course of discussing the celeriac, she also mentioned that Mr. Featherby had been seen, the previous Tuesday evening, in conversation with a man she did not recognize, not local, she thought, or not locally familiar, though she was prepared to be wrong, outside the lending library at around 6:30, when she herself had been returning a book that was past its due date. Miss Marple asked if the man had been carrying anything. Mrs. Elcott thought about this, which was itself illuminating, because it meant she had not considered it before. She said, after a moment, that he had been carrying a bag, a briefcase, possibly, or one of those flat document cases. Something flat, at any rate. Miss Marple thanked her and moved on to the vegetable stall, where she bought parsnips. Later that morning she stopped at Hadley's chemist for a small tin of the eucalyptus chest rub she used in cold weather, which she had not yet needed but thought she might, given the damp. Mr. Hadley was behind the counter, and behind his shoulder, restocking the shelves, was his Saturday assistant, a young woman named Peg Salter, who had been, until her marriage 3 years ago, Peg Vane, and who had before her marriage worked part-time at Featherby's, keeping his accounts. Miss Marple and Mr. Hadley discussed the chest rub, and Miss Marple mentioned that she had also been meaning to ask whether the new vitamin preparation had come in, as she had put herself down for it in October. Mr. Hadley checked his ledger. In the course of checking, they discussed several other things, including the situation at the clock shop, and Mr. Hadley mentioned that it was a terrible business, and that he hoped Mr. Featherby hadn't had some sort of episode, as he had collected a new prescription only last Monday and had looked, in Mr. Hadley's opinion, a little drawn. From behind Mr. Hadley's shoulder, Peg Salter said, not quite to either of them, that Mr. Featherby had always been very careful about his health. She said it in the particular tone of someone who is correcting a general statement with a specific one and is aware that the correction has slightly more weight than the occasion formally requires. Miss Marple looked at the row of vitamin preparations on the shelf and said that careful people were sometimes the most difficult to worry about, because everyone assumed they had already attended to things. Peg Salter did not reply to this, but she became very concentrated, suddenly, on the bottles she was arranging, and Miss Marple observed, without appearing to observe anything at all, that the young woman's hands had paused in their work for just a moment before resuming. That evening, Miss Marple sat for some time by the kitchen window watching the garden, which was very still under a clearing sky, the last of the dahlias brought in and the beds prepared. The fragments of the day arranged themselves as they always did, not pushed, not ordered, only placed, the way a good puzzle piece settles when you stop pressing it and simply hold it near the right location. She had not been trying to learn anything. She had merely been present. Chapter 4, Wednesday afternoon. Miss Marple's Wednesday visitor, that particular week, was her friend Dorothy Hartley, who walked from Mill Lane at 2:30 with her coat buttoned against the weather and a tin of homemade shortbread, which she placed on the table between them in the way of a small but sincere offering. Dorothy Hartley was a woman of 70, who had lived in Brecklingford for 40 years and possessed, in Miss Marple's private estimation, one of the most reliable memories in the county. Not photographic, nothing so showy, but the kind of memory that retained without effort the precise social cartography of a place, who was on which terms with whom, what had been said at which occasion, and, most valuably, what had not been said, and by whom, in what company. They had, as was their custom, tea first, during which they discussed several things that were not Mr. Featherby, including the state of the elm tree in Miss Marple's garden, which Dorothy felt was becoming dangerous, and whether Miss Tanner's haberdashery prices had risen this autumn, which they both felt they had. Then, quite naturally, as they moved to the shortbread, Dorothy said that she supposed it was all very worrying about Owen Featherby. Miss Marple agreed that it was. Dorothy said she had always found him a rather private man, but perfectly pleasant. She said she had not known him to have much in the way of close connections in the village. He had come to Brecklingford only 7 years ago, not long before his wife died, and had always seemed to Miss Hartley the kind of person who had arrived carrying something that he did not intend to put down. Miss Marple said that was a very acute observation. She asked whether Dorothy knew anything about his affairs before he came to Brecklingford. Dorothy, who had been waiting, with the patience of a well-trained memory, for exactly this question, said that she understood he had previously kept a shop in Norwich. Watch and clock repair, the same trade. She also said, and here she applied a small, concentrated focus to her shortbread, that there had been, she seemed to recall, some trouble there. Nothing specific that she could name. Only that someone had mentioned, at some point, that things had not ended tidily. She could not, she said, remember who had told her, which was honest, and which in Miss Marple's experience was the most reliable marker of genuine recollection versus confabulation. Miss Marple said she believed there were particular difficulties in that sort of trade, where one held valuables belonging to others. The responsibility was considerable. Dorothy looked up and said that she'd never thought of it that way, but of course that was quite true. They finished the shortbread. Dorothy left at 4:15, stopping to admire the celeriac on the counter on her way out, and Miss Marple washed the cups and stood for a moment at the kitchen window. She found, thinking about Peg Salter. Not about anything Peg Salter had said, precisely. About the quality of her silence, after Miss Marple's observation about careful people. It was not the silence of someone who had not heard. It was not the silence of someone who had heard and did not understand. It was the silence of someone who had heard, understood perfectly, and was choosing, with some effort, not to speak. In Miss Marple's considerable experience of human nature, that particular kind of silence had a name, and the name was not ignorance, and it was not indifference. It was the silence of someone who already knew which drawer the secret was kept in and had reasons of their own for keeping the drawer shut. She dried the cups, stacked them on their shelf, and went to sit by the fire with her knitting. Chapter 5, The Notebook. On Friday morning, Constable Dyer called at Miss Marple's door at 10:10, which she had expected, not because she had done anything to invite the call, but because she had the impression, from what little she had seen of Constable Dyer, that he was the kind of young man who would eventually remember that elderly ladies often saw things, and would come around to asking, and would be slightly embarrassed at not having done so sooner. She gave him tea and one of the plain biscuits she kept for callers, and he sat at the kitchen table with his large hands around the cup and told her that Mr. Featherby had still not been found, that the blood on the kitchen floor had been confirmed as Mr. Featherby's, and that there was at present no clear explanation for how the back door had come to be bolted from the inside if Mr. Featherby had left by it. He said they were investigating several lines of inquiry, which was the phrase for when several lines of inquiry were being investigated and none of them was going especially well. Miss Marple asked about the man Mrs. Elcott had seen outside the lending library on Tuesday evening. Constable Dyer said they were looking into that. Miss Marple asked whether anyone had spoken to Peg Salter. Constable Dyer looked up from his tea and said that Mrs. Salter had been briefly spoken to, as she had previously worked for Mr. Featherby. She had not, he said, offered anything of particular note. Miss Marple said she was sure that was right. She said she had been wondering whether the police had found a notebook, a small, worn leather one, among the things that had been scattered on the floor. She had heard about the scatter of items from the workbench and wondered if it had been logged. Constable Dyer said it had. He said there wasn't much in it. Clock repair notes, measurements, part numbers. Miss Marple nodded and said that in her experience, the sort of man who kept a notebook for his work also sometimes used the back pages for other things entirely, and that the back pages were worth looking at, if they hadn't already. She said this in the tone of someone offering a small, generally applicable observation, and then asked whether he took sugar, as she had forgotten to put any out. He left at 11 o'clock, and Miss Marple went to the post office to collect a parcel she had been notified about, and on the way back she walked a slightly longer route, along the lane that passed behind the high street, which she told herself she was taking because the direct route had a large puddle near the Hartley gate that would not have dried since Tuesday's rain. From the service alley behind the high street, she could see, at a moderate angle, the back of Featherby's shop, the door that had been bolted from the inside, and above it, to the left, the small sash window of the first-floor flat, which had been Mr. Featherby's sitting room. She stood there for a moment with her parcel under her arm, looking at the window in the way she sometimes looked at things when she was not sure yet what she was looking at. Then she walked home. That evening she thought, again, about Norwich, about the trouble that had not ended tidily, about a man who arrived in a village carrying something he did not intend to put down. It reminded her, with some force, of a woman she had known once in St. Mary Mead, a Mrs. Gaywood, who had moved to the village after some unspecified difficulty in Birmingham, who had been perfectly pleasant and carefully private, and who had, after 3 quiet years, received a visitor one autumn afternoon who came in through the garden gate and left by the front door and was never satisfactorily explained. Mrs. Gaywood had moved away that winter, quite voluntarily. There had been no drama. The difficulty, whatever it had been, had followed her, quietly, over time, and she had eventually walked toward it rather than continue the effort of looking the other way. Miss Marple could not have said precisely why she was thinking about Mrs. Gaywood, only that the fit was there, and that when a fit was there, it was generally worth paying attention to. Chapter 6. The Document. It was Sergeant Makepeace who found it, on Saturday afternoon, during a second and more thorough examination of Featherby's workshop. Miss Marple was not present for this discovery by any particular design. She had come by on a simple errand. She had thought to collect the cufflinks, which were almost certainly not there to be collected, but which provided a legitimate reason to speak to whoever was managing access to the premises, and which would not seem to Sergeant Makepeace like anything other than what it was, which was an old woman coming to ask about cufflinks. Sergeant Makepeace was a compact, precise man of 50 with the manner of someone who had organized his conclusions into neat rows and visited them regularly. He received Miss Marple with courtesy and the mild resignation of a man who has not been asked for very much by elderly ladies and does not intend to start. He was in the process of cataloging the contents of the large wooden chest that stood against the back wall of the workshop, a chest that had been examined on Wednesday, but only superficially, its top tray removed and found to contain tools and clock parts and set aside. What Sergeant Makepeace found now, lifting the bottom panel of the chest, which turned out to be a false bottom of considerable ingenuity, was a flat tin box. Inside the flat tin box were 3 things: a building society passbook, a folded document in a solicitor's envelope, and a second document which was not in an envelope and which, when unfolded, proved to be what appeared to be a duplicate receipt, a carbon copy of a sale receipt for a collection of antique pocket watches dated 4 years prior, with a buyer's name and a total that, even at a glance, was substantial. The solicitor's document, when Sergeant Makepeace unfolded it, proved to be a deed of agreement. He read it in silence. Miss Marple, who had been standing a little to the left of the chest, could see the documents well enough, and was looking at them in the way she looked at most things, without urgency, without display, and with a completeness of attention that she had long since learned to contain within an expression of mild and general interest. She could see the name on the receipt. She said nothing. After a moment she said, looking not at the documents but at the leather notebook, which had been replaced in the box after Constable Dyer's earlier examination, that it was interesting how much could be carried in quite a small space, wasn't it, when a person was determined to keep things tidy. Sergeant Makepeace looked up from the document in his hands. Miss Marple said that the passbook had a very regular pattern of deposits, didn't it? She had a friend who had once described a similar passbook as looking like a landlord's accounts, only without any property to show for it. She then asked, in the same mild key, whether anyone had looked into whether there were arrangements, formal arrangements, between Mr. Featherby and any other parties relating to the Norwich business. Sergeant Makepeace looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who is reviewing his recent assumptions and finding the review somewhat uncomfortable. He said he would make inquiries. Miss Marple thanked him and said she was sorry about the cufflinks, that they could wait, and that he was doing an excellent job under very difficult circumstances, which she meant sincerely, and which she said in a tone that allowed him to accept it without embarrassment. She walked out through the front of the shop and stood for a moment on the high street in the thin afternoon light. It was there now. She could see the shape of it. Not all of it. Not the last piece, but the shape, and that was usually enough. Chapter 7. The Fire and the Full Picture. On Saturday evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire. She had made herself a supper of the pressed tongue from Spence's and some bread, and she had placed the plate on the low table beside her chair and eaten it in the particular way she ate when she was thinking, without attending to it, but without waste. The fire had been built up well and was burning steadily, the elm which she had used for the bottom logs settling and sighing as elm wood does, which is more patient than other woods. The room was warm and very quiet, the kind of quiet that has texture, that is not merely the absence of noise, but is the presence of something slower and more domestic. She did not direct her thoughts. She had learned, over many years and in many different situations, that to direct her thoughts was to narrow them, and it was from the periphery, the unconsidered edge of attention, that the most useful material tended to arrive. She thought about the bolted door. Everyone had thought about the bolted door from the inside. Who could have bolted it, and how, and whether there was some trick by which a bolt could be operated from the outside. These were interesting questions, but they were interested in the wrong direction. The right question was not how the door had come to be bolted. The right question was when. She thought about the mug that had been warm. Mrs. Coburn had arrived at 8:30. The mug had been warm. This had been presented as evidence that something had happened not long before Mrs. Coburn arrived. But a mug that has been broken and lies on a stone floor loses its warmth quite quickly. A mug that is warm at 8:30 had been broken, at the earliest, an hour before, which placed it at 7:30 in the morning or later. She thought about Mr. Featherby, who had collected his prescription on Monday and looked drawn. She thought about Peg Salter's hands, which had stopped moving. She thought about the receipt in the tin box and the name on it, which she had seen quite clearly, and which was not a stranger's name. It was not the name of the unidentified man from Norwich, or whatever other external party Sergeant Makepeace was now composing inquiries to. It was a name she knew, and had known for several years, and had associated, as the whole village associated it, with perfect ordinariness and perfect respectability. She thought about the building society passbook, with its regular deposits. She thought about Mrs. Gaywood, who had eventually walked toward her difficulty rather than continue the effort of looking the other way. And then she thought about what it would mean to be Mr. Featherby, to have come to Brecklington carrying something, to have managed it carefully for 7 years, to have kept the receipt and the agreement in a tin box under a false bottom, to have paid steadily and regularly, and to have received on Tuesday evening a visitor with a flat document case who had not come merely to renegotiate, but to alter the terms entirely, to foreclose them. The mug had not been broken in a struggle that left a man bleeding and gone. The mug had been broken by a man who was already frightened, who was packing in the early hours of Wednesday morning, who had knocked it from the cooker in his hurry, who had left by the back door and bolted it from the outside. She stopped. She considered this for a moment. She placed it beside the constraint that the door had been bolted from the inside. Then she reached, quite steadily, for the other possibility. The possibility that the door had been bolted from inside after Mr. Featherby left, not to conceal his exit, but to conceal someone else's presence. Someone who had been there when he left, and who had remained, and who had bolted the door, and who had then left by the only other means available. The sitting room window, first floor. The drain pipe ran within 18 inches of it. A younger person, or a person accustomed to such things, could manage it. The drop from the first-floor window to the alley was not much more than 10 feet, and the rain barrel was positioned, she recalled from her walk on Friday, directly beneath. She looked into the fire. The receipt bore the name of Peg Salter's father, Gerald Vane, who had died 2 years ago and left his estate to his daughter. The estate which, she was fairly confident, now, had been built partly through Gerald Vane's partnership in a business that had not ended tidily in Norwich. The agreement in the solicitor's envelope would tell the rest of it, she expected. The arrangement by which Mr. Featherby had been paying Gerald Vane, and then, after Gerald Vane's death, had been paying someone acting in his interest, or paying Peg Salter directly, as her father's heir and her father's daughter. And then, on Tuesday, the unidentified man, not Peg Salter's emissary, she thought. Someone else entirely. Someone from the original Norwich business, who had waited 7 years and come now, not to the man who had been quietly paying, but to the man who had original knowledge, who had original evidence, in a tin box, under a false bottom. Mr. Featherby had not been attacked. He had been warned, and he had run. And someone else, not the visitor, not the threat, had been in the house when he did, and had bolted the door behind him, and had left by the window, tidily, to protect something that had nothing to do with the man from Norwich and everything to do with the arrangement that had been running quietly in Brecklington for 7 years. The fire shifted and settled. Miss Marple remained in her chair until it was quite low, and the room had taken on the particular amber quiet of a late and resolved evening, and the elm wood had done its patient work. Then she went to bed. Chapter 8. Tea with Mrs. Salter and the walk home. Mr. Featherby was found on the following Tuesday, in Cromer, which was 37 miles away, and where he had a cousin whom no one in Brecklington had known about, which was perhaps the one genuinely surprising element of the affair. He was, by the time he was found, in reasonable health, and was prepared to speak quite readily to Sergeant Makepeace, having apparently arrived in Cromer with the conviction that the most available relief from 7 years of careful management was simply to explain everything to someone official and begin again. The flat document case, and the man who had carried it, were a separate and larger matter, which passed out of Sergeant Makepeace's hands into others, and which Brecklington followed in the subsequent months with the keen but second-hand interest of a village that has been adjacent to something significant without being at its center. Peg Salter was not charged with anything. The sergeant, in due course, was satisfied that what she had done, which was to enter the shop that morning with the key she had kept from her years of employment, which had seemed more prudent not to mention, and to remove from the tin box the deed of agreement before bolting the door and leaving by the window with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent her girlhood climbing in and out of her father's garden on a dare, was not, strictly, the worst thing that had been done in connection with the case. She had not left the receipt. The receipt, with her father's name on it, had been too much to take without being noticed. She had taken the one document that named her directly and left the rest. Miss Marple called on Peg Salter on Thursday afternoon, at the house on Mill Lane, and was admitted after a pause that lasted just slightly longer than a pause for ordinary surprise. The sitting room was tidy in the way of a room whose occupant has been doing something rather than sitting, and which has been tidied quickly. The sofa had a new cushion on it that matched nothing else in the room. Miss Marple accepted tea and said that she had wanted to call for some time, as she had heard from someone. She didn't remember who. That Peg's little boy had been unwell in October, and she wanted to know he was quite recovered. Peg Salter said he was, thank you, quite recovered. Miss Marple said she was glad. She said that boys of that age, for was he, were remarkably resilient, in general, though it was always frightening at the time. They talked about the boy, whose name was Thomas, and about the school in Fakenham that Peg was hoping for, and about the difficulty of managing one's father's estate when one's father had not been especially organized in his affairs, which Miss Marple raised in the most general of terms, and to which Peg Salter listened with a quality of attention that was very carefully at ease. In Miss Marple's considerable experience of human nature, composed was not the same as easy. Ease was something that inhabited the body without effort, like warmth. Composure was a structure that was assembled and maintained, and it had edges, if you knew how to look for them, and it made a particular kind of silence around it that was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. She did not, at any point, say anything that was not perfectly warm and perfectly ordinary. When she was leaving, standing at the door with her basket, Miss Marple said, as if the thought had only just arrived to her, as thoughts did, she found, at the end of conversations rather than the beginning, that she thought it was very difficult for a young woman to know what to do about a parent's past, when the parent was no longer present to address it. That the instinct to protect was entirely natural. That she thought most people, if they were honest with themselves, would understand it. Peg Salter stood with her hand on the door and looked at Miss Marple for a moment. Then she said that she supposed that was true. Miss Marple said she thought so. She thanked her for the tea, which had been very good, and said that Thomas was a lovely name for a boy, and that she hoped the school in Fakenham worked out. She walked home along Mill Lane, which was at this hour of the late afternoon acquiring the long, horizontal light of a November day in its final portion, when the sky goes from pewter to a soft, beaten gold along the tree line, and the fields on either side of the lane lie very still, and the village sounds, a door, a bicycle, the distant suggestion of someone calling to someone, carry with a clarity they don't have at any other time of day. She walked at her own pace, which was unhurried without being slow, with her basket on her arm and her better coat against the cold. What she was thinking, in the way she thought things now, without sharpness and without pressure, was that the whole affair had been, at its root, an ordinary human situation. A man who had done something wrong and managed it for years, a woman who had inherited a wrong that was not her own and managed that for years, and a third party entirely. The man with the flat document case, who did not belong to Brecklingford at all, who had arrived with the cold efficiency of someone whose interest was not personal but financial, and whose presence had forced everything that had been carefully held below the surface to break through. It was, she thought, not unlike the condition of the elm at the bottom of her garden, which had been slowly hollowing from inside for some years now, and which would need to come down before next autumn, but which from the lane still looked perfectly sound, and made a very good windbreak, and had been doing so for longer than anyone had been paying attention. Things hollow from within, she thought, for a long time before they become visible from without. The hollowing is the real event. The falling is only the announcement. She turned into Croft Lane, where the lights in the front rooms of the cottages were beginning to come on in the early dark, amber and amber and amber down the row, and the smell of wood smoke had settled again into everything, and the village was drawing in around itself for the evening in the ancient, unglamorous, entirely sufficient way of small places that have been doing exactly this, in exactly this order, for longer than any of them could account for. She reached her gate, set her basket down on the step to find her key, and looked back once at the lane. Everything was as it should be, or near enough. That, in Miss Marple's view, was usually the best that could be said of anything, and was, when one came to consider it honestly, quite enough.